Verdun, France, February 1916. In the blood-soaked labyrinth of Verdun, 23 soldiers of the 129th Infantry Regiment entered Tranchées des Ombres with rifles raised. 7 emerged, 3 days later with empty eyes and tongues bitten clean through, unable to speak of what devoured the others. I am the War Maestro, and tonight I reveal how some battlefields don't just claim lives, they hunger for souls long after the guns fall silent. The Battle of Verdun began on February 21, 1916, when German artillery unleashed a storm of shells upon the French defenses. What would follow became one of the longest, bloodiest conflicts of the Great War, a 10-month nightmare claiming over 700,000 lives. The landscape transformed into a hellscape of mud, blood, and shattered bodies where men fought not just against each other, but against the very environment that consumed them. Caporal Louis Maréchal huddled in the communication trench as orders arrived from command. The once decorated soldier, a veteran of 3 years fighting, had grown gaunt, his eyes hollow. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he read the dispatch. The 129th Infantry Regiment was being reassigned to reinforce a section of trenches near Fort Vaux, specifically to an area designated as Tranchées des Ombres, the Trench of Shadows. "More meat for the grinder," muttered Sergeant Dubois beside him, his breath clouding in the February cold. Maréchal said nothing, merely folding the orders and tucking them into his coat. The men of his squad prepared their equipment with practiced efficiency, yet Maréchal noticed the nervous glances exchanged between veterans. Private Émile Boucher, a fresh-faced replacement who had arrived just last week, approached cautiously. "Caporal, I've heard stories about this section," Boucher whispered, eyes darting to ensure others couldn't hear. "They say men vanish there." Maréchal fixed him with a hard stare. "Men vanish everywhere in this war, boy. Artillery doesn't leave much to find." But later that evening, as Maréchal reviewed the battalion's war diary by candlelight, he found troubling notations. 4 separate units had been assigned to Tranchées des Ombres in the past month. Each reported unusual occurrences, unexplained noises, equipment failures, and most disturbing, soldiers found dead with no visible wounds, or others who simply disappeared during routine patrols. The official explanation cited desertion or enemy action, yet the pattern was too consistent. More concerning were the crossed-out sections in the log, as if someone had attempted to redact certain details from the official record. Lieutenant André Bellamy approached, his uniform still relatively clean, marking him as recently arrived from Paris. "Preparing for tomorrow, Caporal. I've been assured this is a routine reinforcement." Maréchal closed the diary. "Nothing is routine at Verdun, Lieutenant. Superstitions will not help morale," Bellamy replied sharply. "I expect your men ready to move before dawn." As Bellamy left, Maréchal returned to the diary, finding one final notation from the previous unit commander. "Request immediate reassignment from Tranchées des Ombres. Men report hearing voices in the walls. Something is not right here." The request had been denied. Outside, the distant thunder of artillery continued its relentless percussion as sleet began to fall, turning the ground to churned mud. By this time, tomorrow, they would be in the Trench of Shadows, where some said the war had awakened something older than the conflict itself. Dawn broke gray and cheerless as Maréchal led his men through a network of communication trenches toward their new position. The closer they came to Tranchées des Ombres, the thicker the fog grew, clinging to their uniforms like spectral hands. The constant artillery bombardment had transformed the landscape into a lunar wasteland, shell holes filled with brackish water, splintered trees reduced to blackened stumps, and everywhere the sweet, sick smell of death. "Mind your feet," Maréchal warned as they navigated a particularly worn section. "And check your gas masks. Germans have been using phosgene in this sector." Lieutenant Bellamy consulted his map, frowning. "Strange. This trench doesn't appear on the updated charts." "Maps become obsolete quickly here, Lieutenant," Maréchal replied, though something about the lieutenant's observation unsettled him. They reached Tranchée des Ombres by mid-morning. Unlike the standard trenches, straight lines with traverses, this one curved unnaturally, following no discernible tactical purpose. Its walls seemed oddly smooth in places, almost polished, while other sections appeared hastily reinforced with whatever materials had been available: splintered timber, corrugated iron, and in one disturbing instance, what looked like human bones incorporated into the structure. A haggard corporal from the unit they were relieving approached. His uniform hung from his gaunt frame, and his eyes darted nervously. "You the replacements? Thank Christ. We've been waiting 3 days past rotation." "Report, Corporal," Bellamy demanded. "Nothing to report, sir. All quiet." The man's voice cracked. His hands trembled as he glanced back toward the trench. "Just don't patrol the eastern section after sunset. And if you hear someone calling your name from behind the parapet, don't answer." Before Bellamy could question him further, the corporal hurried away, gathering his remaining men, a pitiful handful compared to a standard company. They departed without the usual banter or relief of soldiers leaving the front. That evening, as Maréchal established the watch rotation, Private Boucher approached him again. "Caporal, the men from the previous unit, they left all their personal effects behind." Maréchal followed Boucher to a dugout where knapsacks, letters, photographs, and even pocket watches lay abandoned. No soldier, especially veterans, would willingly leave such treasures behind. "They left in a hurry," Maréchal muttered, picking up a worn Bible. A name was inscribed inside: Corporal Julien Mercier, the same haggard corporal who had briefed them earlier. "But that's not all," Boucher whispered, leading Maréchal deeper into the dugout. In the farthest corner, scratched into the wooden support beam, was a warning: "Ils sont dans les murs. Ils nous observent. Ils attendent." They are in the walls. They are watching us. They are waiting. The first patrol disappeared on March 2nd, 1916. 4 men led by Sergeant Dubois ventured into the eastern section of Tranchée des Ombres shortly before midnight. Standard procedure: 20 minutes out and back. When 2 hours passed with no sign of them, Lieutenant Bellamy ordered a search party. 3 men, no more," he instructed Maréchal. "I won't risk further losses." Maréchal selected Boucher and Private Rousseau, a seasoned veteran with nerves of steel. They checked their level rifles, ensuring each had a full magazine, then moved cautiously into the fog-shrouded eastern section. The trench here diverged from military engineering principles. It twisted at unnatural angles, creating blind corners that left the men vulnerable. Their lanterns cast dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The walls glistened with moisture that caught the light like watching eyes. "Dubois! Report!" Maréchal called, his voice swallowed by the unnatural acoustics. Boucher froze suddenly. "Listen." Beneath the distant artillery, a sound emerged, faint, rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. "Morse code?" Rousseau suggested. "No," Maréchal realized with growing dread. Footsteps, coming from inside the wall. They followed the sound to a section where the trench widened slightly. Their lantern light revealed boot prints in the mud, 4 sets leading toward the expanding darkness, none returning. The footprints ended abruptly at the eastern wall. "Impossible," Rousseau whispered, touching the solid earth. "They couldn't have—" A sudden cry from Boucher cut him off. The young private stood rigid, pointing to something half buried in the mud. Maréchal brushed away the soil to uncover Dubois's helmet. Inside, a dark stain glistened wetly in the lantern light. "Blood?" Rousseau asked. Maréchal touched it carefully. No, too viscous. The substance clung to his fingers, cold and unnatural. Neither blood nor mud, but something else entirely. Suddenly, from somewhere deeper in the trench, came Dubois's voice, unmistakable despite its uncharacteristic sing-song quality. "Venez voir ce que j'ai trouvé." Come see what I found. Rousseau raised his rifle instinctively. "That's not the sergeant." "We're returning to the dugout," Maréchal ordered, fighting the desire to investigate. Military discipline had kept him alive for 3 years in this war. He wouldn't abandon it now. As they retreated, Maréchal felt something brush against his neck, warm breath that carried whispered words in what sounded like Old French. "La terre se souvient de tous ceux qui sont tombés ici." The earth remembers all who have fallen here. When they returned to report, Lieutenant Bellamy documented the incident with clinical detachment. Patrol missing, presumed deserters or casualties of enemy action. 1 helmet recovered, no bodies found. But that night, as wind whistled through the trench, every man heard the voices, soft, persistent, speaking not just in French and German, but in tongues far older, languages dead for centuries. March 5, 1916. Lieutenant Bellamy summoned the company officers to the command dugout, his uniform still pristine despite their squalid surroundings. Maréchal noticed the lieutenant's meticulously maintained appearance was beginning to fray, his collar unbuttoned, stubble darkening his once smooth jaw. 3 more men missing last night," Bellamy announced, consulting his logbook. "That brings our losses to 7 in 3 days without enemy contact." His pen tapped nervously against the wooden table. "I've requested reinforcements and reassignment." "And?" Maréchal asked. "Denied. We're to hold position until further notice." Bellamy's clinical facade cracked slightly. "Command suggests the men are deserting." Sergeant Lebrun, who had replaced Dubois, scoffed. "Deserting? Where to? The German lines? Men who've survived 3 years of this hell don't suddenly flee." Bellamy closed his logbook with forced precision. "I'm implementing new protocols. No one patrols alone. No one acknowledges unusual sounds. The men are succumbing to war neurosis. Suggestions of supernatural phenomena, merely mass hysteria triggered by artillery concussion and sleep deprivation." The rational explanation hung unconvincingly in the stale air of the dugout. None of the officers spoke the truth aloud, that each had experienced things defying explanation. Maréchal had caught Lebrun speaking to empty air the previous night. The medic had begun documenting strange markings appearing on soldiers' skin, perfect circular bruises that formed while men slept. After the briefing, Maréchal found Private Boucher scratching frantically in a journal. "Writing home?" he asked. "Documentation," Boucher replied, not looking up. The normally nervous private had grown strangely calm. "Someone should record what's happening here." Maréchal glimpsed the page, detailed sketches of the trench layout, noting anomalies, sections labeled with dates going back to 1871. "What's this?" Maréchal pointed to the annotation. "Found military archives in an abandoned storage dugout," Boucher explained. "This area was a battleground during the Franco-Prussian War. A French battalion made their last stand here, outnumbered, surrounded. The Germans gave no quarter." "That doesn't explain what's happening now," Maréchal said. Boucher finally looked up, his eyes reflecting something beyond fear, a terrible understanding. "Doesn't it? What if some conflicts never end? What if some battlefields never forget?" Later that day, Lieutenant Bellamy organized a systematic search of the eastern section, determined to find a rational explanation, perhaps a hidden tunnel the Germans were using for raids. 20 men entered the winding passages in broad daylight. They found nothing but mud, water, and the strange viscous substance that seemed to seep from the walls. No evidence of German infiltration, no bodies of missing comrades. That night, Bellamy began muttering in his sleep, phrases in German, then in something older. Maréchal heard him through the dugout wall. Ils reviennent toujours. La bataille n'est jamais terminée. They always return. The battle is never over. March 10th, 1916. A week in Tranchée des Ombres had transformed the men of the 129th. Those who remained, less than half their original number, moved with the careful precision of prey animals. They spoke little, slept less, and kept their backs to the walls at all times. Lieutenant Bellamy had stopped writing in the official log 2 days earlier, after his pen repeatedly filled with the viscous black substance that now seeped from every surface of the trench. That morning, Maréchal found the lieutenant staring at the eastern wall, unblinking. "They're organizing," Bellamy whispered, not turning around. "I can hear them planning their advance." "Who, sir?" Maréchal asked, though he already knew. "The men in the walls, the ones who never stopped fighting." Bellamy pressed his ear against the mud. "Listen, they're speaking in formation now." Maréchal should have reported him. Combat fatigue required medical evacuation, but who remained to report to? Instead, he gently led Bellamy back to the dugout and assigned Rousseau to watch him. A sudden artillery barrage forced the remaining men to shelter in place. German 210 shells hammered their position for hours, collapsing sections of the trench and reshaping the tortured earth once again. When the bombardment finally lifted, Maréchal emerged to assess the damage. In a newly exposed section of wall, something gleamed dully. Using his trench knife, Maréchal carefully excavated the object. A wooden plaque, its surface blackened with age, but its carved inscription still legible. Que ceux qui reposent ici ne trouvent jamais la paix. May those who rest here never find peace. Below the inscription, a date, July 18, 1870. Boucher appeared beside him, eyes wide. "The Franco-Prussian War. This confirms it." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket, a map from the archives he'd discovered. This exact location, a French battalion was surrounded here. When they ran out of ammunition, they fixed bayonets and charged. The Germans cut them down to the last man. "Then what?" Maréchal asked. "The Germans buried them?" "No," Boucher whispered. "According to the account, they left them where they fell. Later, a German officer ordered the bodies thrown into a shell hole and covered with lime. Not proper burial rites. No last rites. Just discarded. And they've been here ever since," Maréchal realized. "Under our feet. In these walls." A strange calm settled over Maréchal, the clarity of finally understanding. The trench hadn't been dug by military engineers following tactical doctrine. It had been shaped by whatever dwelled below, guiding the shovel and pickaxe of unwitting soldiers to create a perfect vessel for its purpose. The revelation was interrupted by a scream from the command dugout. They rushed back to find Rousseau pressed against the far wall, rifle aimed at Lieutenant Bellamy. The officer stood unnaturally still, his eyes now clouded white, mud caking his immaculate uniform. When Bellamy spoke, the voice wasn't his own. It emerged as a layered chorus of dozens of voices speaking in unison. Nous avons été oubliés, mais nous n'avons pas oublié. We have been forgotten, but we have not forgotten. We're leaving, now. Maréchal's order cut through the stifling air of the dugout. The 7 remaining men gathered their essentials: ammunition, water, gas masks. No one bothered with personal effects anymore. Lieutenant Bellamy sat bound in the corner, no longer speaking in the chorus of voices, but instead muttering in a language none of them recognized. Occasionally he would laugh, a hollow sound that echoed unnaturally. "What about him?" Rousseau asked, nodding toward their officer. Maréchal considered the lieutenant, then shook his head. "He's not Bellamy anymore." Outside, an unnatural fog had descended despite the afternoon sun. Visibility extended barely an arm's length. The men formed a chain, each gripping the equipment of the man ahead, with Maréchal leading toward the communication trench that would take them away from Tranchée des Ombres. "Stay close," he ordered. "No matter what you hear, keep moving forward." They hadn't gone 20 meters when the first voice called from the mist. Dubois, pleading for help. Then came others, names of men long dead at Verdun, at the Marne, at places the war had already consumed and forgotten. "Mother of God," whispered Private Laurent from the rear. "That's my brother. But he died at Ypres last year." "Keep moving," Maréchal commanded, tightening his grip on Boucher's webbing ahead of him. "It's not them." The fog thickened impossibly, taking on texture and substance. It pressed against them with physical weight, smelling of gunpowder and decay. Their boots sank deeper into mud that seemed to pull at them with deliberate force. A shell screamed overhead, German 77mm, its distinctive sound unmistakable to veterans, detonating somewhere to their right. But the explosion produced no shockwave, no debris, only a perfect recreation of the sound. "Artillery that doesn't hit anything," Boucher muttered. "Rifles that jam when aimed at shadows. Whatever this is, it knows warfare. It speaks the language of battle." They reached the junction where the communication trench should have connected to their position. Instead, they found a blank wall of earth. "Impossible," Maréchal breathed, pressing his hands against the solid dirt. "I navigated this approach myself. The trench was here." "It doesn't want us to leave," Boucher said simply. They tried another direction, then another, each attempt leading to a dead end that shouldn't exist. The trench had reconfigured itself around them, transforming from a defensive fortification into an elaborate trap. "We'll go over the top," Maréchal decided, desperate now. Better to risk German snipers than stay here. Using a damaged trench ladder, they climbed one by one toward the surface. As Laurent, the last man, reached for the top rung, Maréchal heard him gasp. Looking down, he saw the young private being pulled back into the mud by hands, dozens of dirt-caked hands, emerging from the trench wall. "Help me!" Laurent screamed, clawing at the ladder as the hands dragged him inexorably backward. Rousseau and Maréchal fired their rifles into the writhing mass, but each bullet struck mud harmlessly, the firearms suddenly impotent against whatever held their comrade. Laurent vanished into the wall itself, his scream cutting off abruptly as the mud sealed seamlessly behind him. The remaining 6 men crawled across the blasted landscape of no man's land, expecting German fire at any moment. Instead, they found only more fog and, eventually, the same trench they had tried to escape. Tranchée des Ombres, waiting patiently for their return. In the distance, artillery thundered, real artillery this time, walking ever closer to their position. September 14th, 1916. The French army had abandoned all attempts to relieve or contact the men in Tranchée des Ombres. Official records later classified the entire unit as missing in action, presumed dead, a convenient designation that required no further investigation. In truth, The 6 survivors had continued to exist in a nightmarish limbo. The trench provided just enough rations to sustain them: moldy bread, tainted water, and occasionally fresh supplies that materialized in previously empty dugouts. Time became meaningless. The sun rose and set, but with no discernible pattern. Sometimes night lasted for what seemed like days, while daylight hours compressed into brief interludes of gray illumination. Private Bauscher maintained his documentation until his journal pages ran out, then continued writing on trench walls with a mixture of mud and his own blood. His entries grew increasingly fragmented, but revealed a horrifying pattern. The Trench of Shadows reappeared throughout military history, always in locations where soldiers had been denied proper burial. "It's not just one battle," he explained to Maréchal, his once nervous demeanor replaced by feverish certainty. "It's every battle, every forgotten soldier. A collective consciousness formed from abandoned dead." Maréchal, now the sole remaining officer, had watched helplessly as Rousseau and 2 others vanished during an artillery barrage that somehow breached their position without leaving a single shell hole. The walls simply opened and took them, leaving behind only their equipment, arranged in neat piles as if for inspection. Now only Maréchal, Boucher, and Private Martinet remained. Martinet hadn't spoken in weeks, his eyes fixed permanently on the middle distance, flinching at movements no one else could see. That evening, as an unnatural mist rolled through the trench, Maréchal felt a change in the air pressure, a subtle shift that every experienced soldier recognized as the prelude to something momentous. "They've decided," Boucher whispered, looking up from his writings. "The forgotten soldiers have reached a verdict." "About what?" Maréchal asked, though he already knew. "About us, whether we belong with them." The mist thickened, coalescing into distinct shapes, soldiers in outdated uniforms from the Franco-Prussian War, their features indistinct except for their eyes, hollow voids that reflected nothing. Among them stood Lieutenant Bellamy, his once immaculate uniform now rotted and mud-caked, his movements jerky, as if controlled by unseen strings. Beside him walked Sergeant Dubois, Private Laurent, and all the others who had vanished over the months. But most disturbing of all, Maréchal saw himself among them. A perfect duplicate down to the scar on his left cheek, awarded by German shrapnel at the Marne. His doppelganger stepped forward, hand outstretched in silent invitation. "They want us to join them," Martinet whispered, his voice rusty from disuse. "To become part of the memory." Boucher stepped forward without hesitation, taking the hand of his own double. "They're not malevolent," he said with strange certainty. "They're just forgotten, and the forgotten eventually forget themselves." The 2 Bouchers merged in a swirl of mist, leaving behind only his journal and rifle. Martinet followed moments later, walking toward his duplicate with the relief of a man finally permitted to lay down an unbearable burden. Alone now, Maréchal faced his other self. In those hollow eyes, he saw not malice, but an endless reflection of battles, men fighting and dying across centuries, denied peace, denied remembrance. "I understand now," Maréchal said quietly. "The trench doesn't kill, it preserves." His duplicate nodded slowly, then spoke with Maréchal's voice, yet layered with countless others. "The war never ends for those history abandons." Caporal Louis Maréchal took his doppelganger's outstretched hand and stepped into the wall of the trench. 3 days later, a fresh French unit was assigned to the position. They found Tranchée des Ombres empty but intact. 7 rifles neatly stacked against a wall, equipment laid out for inspection, and a journal filled with impossible accounts. Military authorities classified the journal and dismissed its contents as the ravings of men broken by battle stress. The trench was renamed, its coordinates altered on official maps, and the incident buried in bureaucracy. But local farmers near Verdun claim that on foggy nights they still hear the sounds of men marching through mud, and sometimes voices calling out names of soldiers long forgotten by history, but remembered by the earth that holds them. If this dispatch from the War Maestro's archive has left you hearing whispers in the walls, it's time to enlist in our ranks. Check that your screen isn't seeping with that strange viscous substance. Then subscribe to access more classified military horror from forgotten battlefields. Activate the notification bell. You'll want to know immediately when our next sealed file is declassified. Share this account with fellow seekers of dark military history who understand that sometimes the most terrifying entities aren't the enemies across no man's land, but what lingers in the mud long after the guns fall silent. Leave a comment below. Have you ever visited a battlefield where time felt wrong? Or perhaps you've heard stories passed down from veteran relatives about trenches they refuse to speak of? Remember, some military units in our archives are still listed as missing in action, their stories waiting to be told.